Judge humiliates defendants, then later finds out he's an undercover federal judge. What you're about to hear is a tale that twists the gavel back on the hand that wields it. Before we dive into the story of justice and consequence, comment wherever you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe below. A story of arrogance, humiliation, and a stunning revelation that shook a courtroom to its very core. This isn't just about law. It's about dignity, power, and what happens when a robe that shields authority blinds its wearer to the truth standing right before him. On the courthouse steps, a man stood for a moment, gazing up at the imposing columns. His suit was charcoal gray, neat but modest. It didn't hang with the crisp perfection of bespoke tailor's work. Instead, it bore the slight looseness of something chosen deliberately to blend in. He carried a worn leather notebook tucked under his arm, the cover softened by years of handling. His face was calm, his eyes steady, but his posture held the quiet weight of someone who knew the value of watching before acting. His name for today was Daniel Hart. He exhaled slowly and began climbing the steps. Each stride was measured, neither hurried nor hesitant, as though he wanted no one to notice him at all. To the people passing by, he was just another man scheduled for another hearing in a courthouse that saw hundreds of faces a week. Inside, the air shifted. The blast of cold-conditioned air met the warmth of wet coats. The metallic chime of the security scanners rang out as people emptied pockets into trays, the bailiffs barking instructions. The marble floors reflected the bright overhead lights, and the scent of wax lingered sharp and sterile. Daniel stepped into line and waited his turn at the metal detector. A bailiff gave him a once-over, eyes pausing a beat longer than usual on his slightly worn shoes, before waving him through. He retrieved his notebook, nodded politely, and moved into the atrium. To his left, a row of vending machines buzzed. To his right, a cluster of people whispered nervously. Two young men with tattoos peeking out from under their sleeves, a mother clutching a folder of documents, and an older gentleman adjusting the tie around his thick neck. The courthouse, to most who entered, was a place of dread. For Daniel, it was something else entirely today. It was a stage, and he, though appearing to be just another minor defendant, was about to watch performance unfold. Courtroom 4B was already humming when Daniel slipped inside. The heavy wooden benches creaked as people shifted, murmuring to each other in low tones. A clerk tapped rapidly at her computer. The court reporter adjusted the keys of her steno machine. Daniel found a seat near the middle and sat with his notebook resting loosely in his lap. His eyes flicked upward at the golden seal of justice mounted above the judge's bench. He studied the polished gavel resting neatly beside the files. Moments later, the side door opened, and the bailiff's command cut through the noise. All rise. The room shuffled upright. And then he entered, Judge Barrett Ames. His robe billowed slightly as he strode the bench, his expression carved from stone. Ames was a man who radiated authority, like heat from a furnace. His jaw was sharp, his graying hair slicked back meticulously, his eyes carrying the cold gleam of someone who had long ago decided that fear was more useful in a courtroom than respect. He didn't look at the faces in the pews as individuals. He scanned the room like a general surveying his troops, lips pressed in thin disapproval, as though every defendant who passed through was already guilty of wasting his valuable time. He sat. His gavel struck once, the crack echoing off the high ceiling. You may be seated. The docket began. One after another, people stepped forward. A teenager charged with shoplifting. A man accused of unpaid parking tickets. A woman facing a minor assault citation. Judge Ames handled each case with an economy of patience. His tone was clipped, his words laced with disdain. To one, he muttered about raising children who think the world owes them. To another, he rolled his eyes when the public defender asked for more time. Every comment dripped with performance of superiority. Some of the gallery laughed nervously at his barbed remarks. Others kept their heads down, praying their own cases would pass quickly without attracting the sting of his words. Then the clerk called a new name. Case number 24, the 317. State versus Daniel Hart. Daniel rose. His suit caught the fluorescent light, revealing its slight fray at the cuffs. He walked steadily to the podium, laying his notebook on its surface, and lifted his gaze to meet Judge Ames's eyes. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said evenly. Judge Ames tilted his head, narrowing his gaze as if sizing him up. We'll see about the good, Mr. Hart. You're here for failure to comply with a court order. According to this report, you refused to move along when instructed by an officer outside this courthouse, loitering, causing a disturbance. Is that accurate? Daniel's tone remained calm. I was asking where to file a complaint. There was confusion about the correct window. Judge Ames's lips twitched into something that resembled amusement. Of course. Confusion. Epidemic these days. People can't read a sign to save their lives. And so the rest of us are forced to suffer their ignorance. He flipped through the file with exaggerated irritation. And I see you didn't bring an attorney. I prefer to speak for myself, Daniel answered. Ames leaned forward. People who think rules are optional usually prefer to speak for themselves. Saves them from having to listen when someone tells them the truth. He set the file down sharply. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor. Ames gave a dry laugh. Naturally, you do realize you've wasted the court's time. An officer had to be pulled from his duties. Clerks distracted, taxpayers' money spent. All because you couldn't follow a simple instruction. Do you have any idea what it costs the people of this county when men like you decide to make yourselves nuisances? Daniel inhaled quietly, then said, I was within my rights to ask a question, Your Honor. I didn't shout, threaten, or interfere. I was attempting to exercise due process. The words hung in the air. For a moment, silence lingered. Then Judge Ames smirked. Now you're a lawyer, too. Wonderful. Let me educate you. This is my courtroom. I decide what constitutes interference. And right now, your attitude is interference enough. He picked up his gavel, tapped it twice, and said coldly, I find you in contempt. $1,000. Payable today. If you cannot pay, 30 days in county jail will suffice. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Heads turned. A few people shook their heads in disbelief. The clerk shifted uneasily, her fingers pausing over her keyboard. Daniel's face didn't change. His voice was steady. Your Honor, respectfully, there's been no hearing, no testimony. Contempt requires a finding of fact. Judge Ames cut him off with a sharp crack of the gavel. Save the lecture for someone who cares. You'll pay today, or you'll enjoy a vacation at county. Next case. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, then spoke softly into the microphone. Let the record reflect that the defendant accepts the ruling and reserves all rights. Judge Ames waved dismissively. Get off my podium, Mr. Hart. Daniel picked up his notebook, nodded once, and walked back to the seat. He wrote 2 words quietly inside, noted, confirmed. Then he closed the book as the next defendant shuffled forward. The gavel's echo still lingered in Daniel's ears as he stepped out of courtroom 4B. The heavy oak door swung shut behind him, muffling the drone of the next case. The hallway outside was dimmer, its walls lined with notice boards and aging photographs of past county officials. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed faintly overhead. Daniel's footsteps were measured on the marble floor. He stopped by the long bench against the wall, sat for a moment, and opened his notebook again. He scribbled a line, mockery weaponized. Contempt without process. Record behavior pattern. Hey, Hart. The voice was sharp, nasal. The bailiff from 4B, a thick-set man with a buzz cut and permanent frown, stepped into the hallway. His badge gleamed under the lights, and his hand rested casually on the belt that carried his sidearm and baton. You're headed the wrong way. Payment windows downstairs. Unless you'd rather spend 30 nights looking at bars. Daniel closed his notebook calmly. I'll find the window. Thank you. But the bailiff didn't move. He smirked instead, his blue eyes narrowing. You got real brave in there, didn't you? Talking back to the judge like you knew the law. I ought to cuff you myself for that stunt. Daniel met his stare evenly. Exercise of my rights is not a stunt. The bailiff leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Daniel could hear. You think the robe doesn't see through you? You look like every other punk that comes in here, thinking they're smarter than the system. Newsflash, the system wins. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Perhaps, but sometimes the system forgets what it was built for The bailiff frowned, uncertain at the calm in Daniel's tone. For a flicker of a second, something in Daniel's eyes unsettled him, but pride was louder than instinct. He straightened, pointing down the corridor. "Go pay your fine, Mr. Wrights, and pray you never step foot in 4B again, because next time the judge won't stop at a fine." Daniel stood, slipping the notebook under his arm. "We'll see." He walked away, leaving the bailiff bristling in the hallway. At the far end of the corridor, near a bank of elevators, Daniel noticed a young court clerk from earlier, Mara Willis. Her dark hair was pinned neatly, her glasses perched low on her nose as she flipped through a stack of forms. She seemed younger outside the courtroom, less stiff, though the weight of responsibility still bent her shoulders. She glanced up, surprised to see him. Her eyes darted left, then right, making sure no supervisor was within earshot. "Sir," she said in a hushed tone, Are you all right?" Daniel offered a faint smile. "I've been through worse. Thank you for asking." Mara shifted uncomfortably, lowering her voice further. I don't agree with how that went in there. Judge Ames, he does that sometimes. He mocks people, hands out contempt like it's candy. But today," she bit her lip. It fell harsher. Daniel studied her. She was caught between conscience and fear. Her eyes carried the haunted look of someone who had seen dozens of small injustices, but felt powerless to change them. "You noticed," Daniel said softly. "That matters." Her brow furrowed. "Not enough. People file complaints, but they disappear into a drawer, or they get dismissed for lack of evidence. And everyone's afraid to speak up because, well, you saw how he is." Daniel leaned closer, his tone gentle but firm. "Every system that fails begins with silence. You chose to notice. That's the beginning of courage." Mara blinked at him, startled by the gravity of his words. She straightened slightly, as though those simple sentences had shifted something inside her. The bailiff's heavy boots clomped down the corridor. Mara quickly looked away, shuffling her papers. Daniel gave her a small nod of thanks before turning toward the elevators. The payment window was tucked in the basement level, behind a faded sign that read Clerk's Office, Fines and Fees. A tired woman sat behind the plexiglass, clicking her nails against the counter as she processed payments. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a sickly green tint over the tile floor. Daniel slid the contempt receipt across the counter. $1,000. Card. The clerk raised an eyebrow, surprised at the amount, but said nothing. She processed the payment, handed him a stamped copy, and muttered, "Next." Daniel stepped aside, studying the receipt. To anyone else, it was a financial punishment, a mark of shame. But to him, it was something else entirely, evidence. Tangible proof of a deeper rot. He tucked it carefully into his notebook, between pages already filled with meticulous handwriting. Lines about due process ignored. Notes on body language, tone, abuse of discretion. This wasn't the first courtroom he had observed. But rarely had the imbalance of power been so raw, so naked. As he left the payment office, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He slipped into a quiet alcove before answering. "Yes," he said, his voice dropping into its natural cadence, deeper and more assured than the soft-spoken tone he had used in 4B. A crisp female voice replied on the secure line. "Judge Mercer, are you safe?" "I am." Daniel, Judge Isaiah Mercer in truth, answered. "The encounter confirmed our reports." He mocked a tire. Equated poverty with disrespect. Handed down contempt without process. It was performative, not judicial. The voice was calm, professional. "Understood. The chief is expecting your debrief at 2:00. Will you be ready?" "I'll be there," Isaiah said. His eyes flicked back toward the stairwell, leading to 4B. Today was instructive, for him as much as for me. He ended the call, slid the phone back into his pocket, and walked toward the exit. As Isaiah pushed the courthouse doors, the bailiff was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching. He straightened as Isaiah approached, his smirk curling. "Enjoy paying tuition for your little lesson?" the bailiff jeered. Isaiah paused, meeting his gaze. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried a gravity that made the smirk falter just slightly. "One day, Isaiah said quietly. You'll realize the uniform you wear doesn't protect you from accountability. It only magnifies it. The bailiff blinked, caught off guard by the weight in his voice. Before he could muster a response, Isaiah stepped past him, descending the courthouse steps into the cool afternoon air. For a moment, the bailiff simply stood there, unsettled by the strange certainty in the man's words. Isaiah walked slowly down Cedar Street, blending back into the city crowd. Cars honked at a busy intersection. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointing at a balloon vendor. Life moved on around him, oblivious to the small earthquake that had just shaken Courtroom 4B. Inside his chest, Isaiah felt a quiet storm brewing. Not anger, that would be too easy. What he carried was resolve. The kind of resolve that comes when injustice is no longer abstract but personal, witnessed and felt in the marrow. He thought of Mara's hesitant voice. Complaints disappear into a drawer. He thought of the bailiff's sneer. The system wins. He thought of Ames's laughter as he imposed contempt like tossing crumbs to a crowd. Isaiah Mercer had seen much in his years as a federal judge. He had presided over high-profile trials, faced political pressures, and weathered personal threats. But nothing reminded him more sharply of the purpose of his robe in moments like this, when justice was mocked by the very man entrusted to uphold it. He turned the corner, his notebook still tucked safely under his arm. The city stretched out before him, unaware that tomorrow its courthouse would be the epicenter of a revelation none of them expected. The Brookfield Federal Building stood like a sentinel by the river, its glass facade reflecting the fading afternoon sun. Security at the entrance was tighter here than at the county courthouse. Officers scanned badges with professionalism absent in 4BS hallway sneers. Isaiah Mercer entered quietly, his loose charcoal suit still disguising the truth of who he was. But once inside the private elevators, the mask began to slip. By the time the doors opened on the 14th floor, his posture had changed. His shoulders squared, his stride lengthened, and his gaze sharpened with the calm authority of a man stepping back into his true skin. A receptionist nodded respectfully as he passed. "Good afternoon, Judge Mercer. They're waiting in conference room A." "Thank you," Isaiah said. Inside, the conference room hummed with restrained tension. The long mahogany table was lined with officials. Chief Judge Eleanor Klein, sharp-eyed and steady. 2 members of the State Judicial Review Commission, and several federal ethics councils connected via video on the screen at the far wall. Klein rose slightly as Isaiah entered. "Isaiah, thank you for doing this yourself." Isaiah nodded, placing his notebook on the table as he Saturday. "It was necessary. I wanted to feel the weight of that room, the same as every ordinary citizen who walks in there." One of the commission members, a gray-haired woman with a voice like gravel, leaned forward. "And did it match the complaints we've been receiving?" Isaiah opened his notebook, flipping to the fresh notes. "Worse." He mocked clothing, equated poverty with defiance, imposed contempt without testimony or findings. And he wielded his gavel as if it were a club for entertainment. The younger commission member, a man with rimless glasses, frowned. "We've had allegations of that sort before, but always second-hand. Hard to act without first-hand verification." Isaiah slid the contempt receipt across the table. $1,000. Paid today. Documented. The room fell silent for a beat. Even through the video feed, the ethics councils exchanged uneasy glances. Klein spoke first. "That's more than verification. That's lived evidence." Isaiah nodded once. "And it's not just Ames." His bailiff echoed the same contempt. The clerk, Mara Willis, admitted complaints disappear into drawers. This isn't just one man's arrogance. It's a culture he's built in that courtroom. The commission chair sighed heavily. Tomorrow's judicial ethics training session, we intended it as a general workshop. But after this, I'm inclined to make it more pointed. Klein's eyes sharpened. Then let's not waste the opportunity. Tomorrow, we show the bench what accountability looks like. Quietly at first, then, if necessary, publicly. Isaiah leaned back, his voice low but firm. He believes the robe makes him untouchable. Tomorrow, he will learn the robe is borrowed, and it can be taken back. Across town, Judge Barrett Ames sat in his leather recliner, a glass of scotch sweating in his hand. His robe hung on a hook by the door, draped like a trophy. The television murmured the evening news, but he wasn't listening. His mind replayed the morning. That man Hart, or whatever his name was. The way he'd spoken. Calm. Precise. No groveling. No fear. It gnawed at Ames. Most defendants shrank when mocked. This one had simply stared back, his voice steady, his words laced with quiet confidence. Ames scowled, tossing back the rest of his drink. "Contemptuous little bastard," he muttered. "Thought he could lecture me in my courtroom. Not on my watch." His wife, Margaret, passed through the living room with a laundry basket. "Talking to yourself again, Barrett?" "Talking to idiots I'm forced to deal with," he grumbled. Margaret shook her head. "One day, Barrett, that temper's going to cost you. People notice more than you think." He snorted. "Please. They need me. The county needs someone who won't coddle criminals. If I don't keep order, no one will. Those commission types can preach dignity all they want. They don't sit where I sit." Margaret paused, looking at him more seriously than usual. "Maybe, but don't forget, power has a way of turning on the one who abuses it." Ames waved her off. "Not me. Not ever." But even as he said it, unease prickled at the back of his neck. He poured another drink to drown it. In a small apartment cluttered with stacks of papers and textbooks, Mara Willis sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open. The glow lit her face as she scrolled through the state's official judicial complaint portal. She hovered over the submit button, her cursor blinking on the empty text box. Her fingers hovered on the keys. She typed, "Judge Ames mocked the defendant today and issued contempt without due process." She stared at the words, heart pounding. She imagined her supervisor discovering the complaint traced back to her IP address. She imagined losing her job, rent unpaid, loans overdue. Her hand trembled. She deleted the line, closed the laptop, pressed her palms into her eyes. But then she remembered Daniel Hart's voice in the hallway. "Every system that fails begins with silence. You chose to notice. That's the beginning of courage." The words echoed in her chest. She exhaled shakily and opened the laptop again. She began to type slower, more carefully this time. Her complaint was not anonymous anymore. It was hers. Isaiah sat at his own desk in a modest apartment overlooking the river. He had shed his disguise, now dressed in a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled. His notebook lay open, filled with precise notes from the day. He read through them. Each were a weight, a record, a reminder. Then he closed the book and set it beside the contempt receipt. He poured himself a glass of water, not whiskey, and stared out the window at the city lights glittering on the water. Tomorrow, the mask would come off. Tomorrow, the robe of arrogance would be stripped bare. He whispered to himself, not as a vow, but as a truth. Justice is not spectacle. Justice is service. Morning broke crisp and cold. At the state courthouse downtown, banners reading judicial ethics and dignity in practice hung in the lobby. Judges from across the region milled in small groups, sipping coffee, exchanging pleasantries. The atmosphere was professional, polished, expectant. Judge Barrett Ames arrived late, as usual, striding through the glass doors with the air of a man who assumed the room would wait for him. He shook hands with colleagues, flashing the same confident smile that had cowed defendants for years. "Morning, Barrett," one greeted. "Ready for another lecture on dignity?" Ames smirked. "Dignity's overrated. What we need is backbone." He laughed, and the others chuckled obligingly, though one or two exchanged subtle glances. Unbeknownst to him, the man he had humiliated less than 24 hours earlier was already in the building. This time, not as Daniel Hart the defendant. This time, as Judge Isaiah Mercer, seated at the head table beside Chief Judge Klein, preparing to address the entire assembly. The stage was set. The mirror was waiting. The state courthouse lobby buzzed like a hive. Coffee urns hissed. Paper cups stacked high on linen-draped tables. Judges mingled in clusters, trading stories of crowded dockets and impossible caseloads. Laughter rose in short bursts, then softened into murmurs of politics and procedure. The banner above the check-in desk read, Judicial Ethics and Dignity in Practice, Annual Training. Judge Barrett Ames arrived with the swagger of a man who thought himself untouchable. His navy suit was pressed to perfection. His silk tie knotted just so. He carried himself with the same superiority that filled his courtroom. A man convinced the world needed his brand of order. He slapped shoulders, cracked jokes at defendants' expense, and smirked at the phrase dignity printed on the banners. Backbone, he muttered to a colleague. That's what we need more of, not sermons about kindness. Unbeknownst to him, across the room at the front table, Judge Isaiah Mercer sat beside Chief Judge Eleanor Klein. Gone was the loose thrift store suit of Daniel Hart. Now, Isaiah wore a dark, perfectly fitted federal judge's robe, its weight symbolic and undeniable. His presence commanded quiet authority. Some attendees glanced at him with recognition, whispering his name. For those who didn't know him, his calm composure carried an aura that demanded respect before a word was even spoken. The moderator tapped the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? Today's training is about more than procedure. It is about the moral temperature we set in our courtrooms. We are honored to begin with opening remarks from Chief Judge Eleanor Klein of the United States District Court. Applause scattered through the room. Ames clapped politely, only half listening as Klein rose and spoke with warmth about justice as service, about how dignity is not a luxury, but the very foundation of legitimacy. He rolled his eyes slightly, sipping his coffee. Then Klein smiled. And now, I am honored to introduce a colleague whose commitment to courtroom dignity has shaped national standards. Please welcome the Honorable Isaiah Mercer. A hush spread. Some leaned forward. Others stilled their pens. Ames froze, his hand midway to his cup. The name rang faintly in his memory, though he couldn't place it. He shifted in his seat, irritated by his own unease. Isaiah stepped to the podium. He waited for silence, his gaze sweeping the room, steady, unhurried, almost surgical. Thank you, Chief Judge Klein. Isaiah began, his voice deep, resonant. Before we discuss policy or protocol, I want to tell you a story that happened only yesterday, in a county courtroom not far from here. Ames's pulse ticked faster. Isaiah continued. A defendant stood alone without counsel. He had asked a simple question at a clerk's window, where to file a complaint. For that, he was told to move along. When he came before the bench, he was mocked for the thrift of his suit. Laughter rose from the gallery. And then, without testimony, without findings, without due process, he was held in contempt, fined $1,000, payable immediately, or 30 days in county jail. A ripple spread through the crowd. A few judges frowned. Others murmured in disbelief. Isaiah's eyes scanned the room, pausing just long enough to rest on Ames, though not naming him. That moment is not an anecdote for amusement, Isaiah said, his tone sharpening. It is a mirror, and it shows us what happens when the robe becomes a weapon instead of a trust, when authority feeds on humiliation instead of serving justice, when dignity is treated not as a duty, but as a nuisance. Ames's hands gripped the armrests. Sweat prickled at his collar. His jaw clenched. Isaiah pressed on. Some might call that an isolated lapse. But how many in this room have heard similar complaints? Mockery, disproportionate fines, disdain disguised as discipline. How many of us have dismissed those complaints as exaggerations from people we already decided were guilty of wasting our time? Silence deepened. No one laughed now. Even the coffee cup stilled. Isaiah's voice softened. Yesterday, I stood in that defendant's shoes. I felt what so many feel when they enter a courtroom and see not a judge, but a wall. A hush fell over the crowd. Ames blinked hard, his brain catching up. He stood in the defendant's shoes? What does he mean? Isaiah straightened. Because yesterday that defendant was me. Gasps erupted. Heads whipped around. Murmurs shot through the hall like sparks. Judges leaned forward in shock, pens frozen above notebooks. Ames went rigid, his face drained. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Isaiah let the words settle. He rested his hand on the podium, steady as stone. My name is Judge Isaiah Mercer, United States District Court, and I went into that courtroom undercover, under the name Daniel Hart. What I experienced was not an inconvenience. It was an indictment. The room crackled with disbelief. Some exchanged wide-eyed glances. A few judges whispered furiously to each other, already guessing who presided in 4B. Ames shrank into his seat, his chest tightening. His ears rang. He could feel invisible eyes turning toward him, recognition dawning in pockets of the room. Isaiah's gaze swept the assembly again. I paid $1,000 yesterday for the privilege of being mocked. It was the most important $1,000 I have ever spent, because it reminded me of what our power feels like from the other side of the bench. Chief Judge Klein stepped forward, her expression unreadable, her presence like steel beneath velvet. "We will take a short recess," she said. "When we return, Judge Mercer and the commission will speak on reforms." "Judge Ames," she let the name drop deliberately, like a gavel striking wood. "Please join us privately." The room buzzed. All eyes turned toward Ames. His skin burned. His legs resisted, but he forced himself to stand, trying to hold what little composure he had left. As he followed Klein and Isaiah into the anteroom, whispers chased him like shadows. The anteroom was small, lined with file cabinets and an old conference table. The hum of the larger hall seeped faintly through the wall. Ames closed the door behind him, his voice breaking into a harsh whisper. "You set me up." Isaiah met his eyes, unflinching. "No, I gave you an opportunity to reveal yourself, and you did." Ames's fist trembled at his sides. "You humiliated me in front of every judge in this state." Isaiah's reply was calm, precise. "I told a true story. If you saw yourself in it, that is not my doing. That is your own reflection." Chief Judge Klein folded her arms. "Judge Ames, the commission has received complaints about your conduct for months. Yesterday confirmed them. This is not about humiliation. It is about accountability." Ames's chest heaved. He looked at them both, desperate to claw back control. "You don't understand county courts. You don't see the liars, the repeat offenders, the circus I deal with daily. You sit in your federal towers and lecture us about dignity." Isaiah cut him off, his voice sharp but not raised. "I have seen liars. I have seen repeat offenders. But I have never forgotten that they are still people. That robe you wear does not make you a king. It makes you a servant. And yesterday you forgot that." Ames swallowed hard, sweat glistening at his temple. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. His voice was gone. Klein's eyes narrowed. "When we return, you will stand before your peers. You may acknowledge your conduct and commit to change, or you may face formal proceedings without the chance to speak first. The choice is yours." Ames's throat worked. His arrogance faltered. For the first time in years, he felt small. The judges filtered back into the hall, murmurs still thick. The moderator tapped the mic again. "We resume." Klein stood at the front. "Before Judge Mercer continues, one of our colleagues has something to say." "Judge Ames." Gasps. Silence. Heads swiveled. Ames stepped forward, each foot heavy. He gripped the podium, his knuckles white. His voice cracked at first, then steadied. "Yesterday, I mocked a man in my courtroom. I fined him without findings. I confused my authority with ownership. And I learned today that the man I mocked was not who I thought. But my failure wasn't in who he was. My failure was in forgetting who I was supposed to be." The room listened, some with disbelief, others with grim satisfaction. Ames inhaled shakily. "I will accept whatever review this commission decides. But I will begin by apologizing to Judge Mercer and to every person who has ever stood in my courtroom and felt smaller because of me." He lowered his head, the words hanging heavy in the stunned silence. Isaiah rose slowly, stepping beside him. His voice carried across the hall. "Apology is a start. Accountability is the path. Reform is a destination." The silence after Judge Ames's halting apology felt like a vacuum. No coughs, no shifting chairs, only the faint hum of the overhead lights. Chief Judge Klein stepped forward, her robe flowing like shadowed steel. She held a folder, its papers crisp and waiting. "Thank you, Judge Ames," she said evenly, though her eyes betrayed no warmth. "Now, the commission will make its position clear." She turned slightly, facing the assembly. Effective immediately, Judge Barrett Ames is suspended from the bench pending a full inquiry. During this period, Courtroom 4B will be reassigned to an acting judge. Furthermore, the Commission is implementing systemic reforms across Brookfield County, to be recommended statewide. Murmurs rippled across the crowd, some shocked, some approving, some fearful of what this meant for themselves. Klein lifted the folder, reading with deliberate weight. First, no contempt citation shall be issued without a clear, recorded finding of fact. Second, all courtrooms must post a visible defendants' rights charter in plain language at their entrances and podiums. Third, all judicial officers and bailiffs will undergo mandatory bias and trauma-informed training. Fourth, a rapid response complaint unit, including community representatives, will be formed. Fifth, quarterly audits of sentencing disparities published publicly. Each line struck the room like hammer blows. Some judges nodded, thoughtful. Others looked uneasy, as though old habits were being pried from their grip. Isaiah Mercer stood beside Klein, watching the faces. He saw the discomfort, the resistance, but also the glimmers of hope. A seed had been planted. Outside, word had already spread. Cameras clustered at the courthouse entrance, reporters shouting questions, microphones thrust forward like weapons of curiosity. When Isaiah and Klein stepped onto the steps, the flashbulbs erupted. The air buzzed with urgency. Judge Mercer, is it true you went undercover as a defendant? One shouted. Isaiah raised his hand gently, commanding silence not through volume but through gravity. The noise quieted. Yes, he said, voice carrying over the crowd. Yesterday, I stood where thousands stand every year, at the podium, accused, vulnerable, mocked. I was fined without cause. I was dismissed without dignity. And I chose to feel that, not because I am different, but because I am the same. Because justice must not be a performance. Justice must be service. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras whirred. Isaiah gestured toward the entrance. The reforms announced today are not punishment. They are correction. The robe is not armor. It is a responsibility. And when that responsibility is abused, it is our duty to act. A voice rose from the side, young, nervous, but clear. It was Mara Willis, the clerk from 4B. She stood among the crowd, clutching her bag. Isaiah noticed her, his gaze softening. He extended a hand toward her. And let us also remember, change is not carried only by judges. This is Mara Willis, a clerk who chose to speak truth in a culture of silence. Courtrooms belong to the public, and they are protected by the honesty of people like her. Mara blushed, stunned at the attention. I just answered a question, she stammered. Isaiah smiled. And sometimes that is the bravest thing to do. In a side corridor of the courthouse, Judge Barrett Ames removed his robe. For the first time in decades, he folded it over his arm like a burden instead of wearing it like a crown. He looked in the mirror above the sink, seeing not the towering figure who commanded silence in 4B, but a man with tired eyes and sagging shoulders. His arrogance had cracked, and behind it, he found something unfamiliar, regret. Margaret's warning echoed in his ears. One day, that temper's going to cost you. It had. For the first time, Barrett Ames wondered if he could learn again how to be a servant instead of a tyrant. A week later, Courtroom 4B looked different. Posters listing defendants' rights now hung near the door and podium. A QR code for filing complaints was taped to the clerk's desk. The bailiff who once sneered had completed new training, standing straighter, quieter, aware of the eyes watching. The acting judge presiding that day spoke gently to a young man, confused about his summons. She explained step by step, her tone firm but never mocking. The man nodded, relief softening his anxious posture. From the back row, Isaiah watched silently. No robe, no spotlight, just a man with a notebook, seeing the weather change 1 degree at a time. In her small apartment, Mara opened an envelope from the commission. Her hands trembled as she read. Your testimony and courage contributed to systemic reforms in Brookfield County. Thank you for your service to justice. Tears pricked her eyes. For once, her honesty had not disappeared into a drawer. It had changed something. Weeks later, at a community center auditorium, Isaiah stood before a crowd of students. The room buzzed with youthful curiosity. Posters on the walls displayed the new courtroom dignity checklist. Isaiah held it up. This is not a bureaucratic form. It is a promise. A promise that when you walk into a courtroom, you are not entering a place to be humiliated. You are entering a place where justice is supposed to meet you as an equal. A student raised her hand. How did you stay calm when he mocked you? Isaiah smiled faintly. Because dignity is not something a judge gives you. Dignity is something you carry, even when others try to strip it away. And I remembered in that moment that the law at its best is not about punishment. It is about recognition, seeing a person where we're tempted to see only a problem. The students applauded, some thoughtfully, some passionately. That evening, Isaiah walked across the bridge over the river. The city lights shimmered on the water below. He stopped halfway, leaning on the rail, his notebook under his arm. He opened it, reading the first line he had written before stepping into 4B. Observe everything. Intervene only when necessary. He added a third line now. Make necessary more often when silence serves only the powerful. Closing the notebook, Isaiah looked at the courthouse skyline in the distance. He whispered, not to the river, not to the city, but to himself. Justice is not a costume. Justice is the courage to listen, the discipline to change, and the humility to serve. Then he turned, walking back into the night, a man who knew that though the fight was endless, it was also worth every step.